Hi, my name is Professor Cesar Marola, and the presentation today is in regards of climate change, public health, and megacities. And we'll be talking about the issues and also health impacts of climate change, as well as risk management and how we can address these hazards through a risk management and a sustainable and strategic planning program. This presentation has different sections, as you can see. Climate change and health risk and megacities, turning theory into reality, prognosis for change, and the conclusion. As you can see in this first slide, we're going to start talking about the definition of health, which is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and normally an absence of disease or infirmity. So coming from the concept of health and definition of health, we can start understanding the nexus between climate, urban areas, and public health. Now, as we know, climate change can affect the health of the population directly, physical effects on the human body, or indirectly as well. Now, the burden on urban areas is being exacerbated by climate change, and the harmful effects, obviously, of climate change are likely to be substantially magnified. We can actually state that the nexus between climate health and cities encompass different issues that are correlated. A city is a system of systems, right? So this model applies to the dependency of the city's resilience to its systems, such as transportation, utilities, and public health infrastructure, as well as communication networks. These systems are individually dependent and also rely on how interdependent those systems are between them. Throughout my research for the last 15 years, I can say, interviewing city mayors, working with leaders of the United Nations, speaking at the United Nations Conference of the Parties, as well as collaborating with Columbia University, Harvard University, academics, and health experts, I established the following statement. The stability of the global economy and political order are critically dependent on two inextricable factors: megacities and public health. Protecting the public health of these urban areas has more far-reaching repercussions than protecting the health of individuals in those densely populated areas. The COVID-19 pandemic is a very good example of it. Simply because a health problem in one megacity can spread rapidly to other parts of the world, leading to widespread public health concerns and destabilizing the megacity's operations. The effects are felt not just in the health sector, but throughout the entire system. Now we go to the next slide. The world turns urban. Significant steps towards a solution are urgently needed to diminish the health risks of the urban populations due to climate change. One of the latest United Nations reports stated that the urban areas of the developing world are expected to absorb an additional 3.1 billion people, while the overall population will grow by just 2.5 billion people by 2050. So the rapid and unplanned expansion of cities, particularly megacities, exposes a greater number of urban residents to climate change health risks and increases their vulnerability to extreme weather events. The health impacts will depend on the region, susceptibility of populations, and the capability of societies to adapt and mitigate the impacts. Obviously, the challenge for cities is to develop an effective urban risk management framework that provides guidance for maintaining and delivering essential services and lessening the effects of climate on health. Therefore, cities need to consider the issues of climate change and urban health by evaluating related risks to identify feasible measures in their planning and management process. So susceptibility to climate change and its effects on health increase as the concentration of economic activity and population density worsens the health situation in the world's major cities. So the impacts of climate change on health are magnified on urban populations. So the capacity of the urban poor, for example, to adapt is weak in comparison to the rest of the population because of inadequate housing, poor nutrition, overcrowded living conditions, which are a very, very present situation in megacities, and population displacement. Resources and information are scarce, and the urban poor, in this case, cannot respond efficiently in order to take actions to mitigate climate change effects. So this situation creates a gradual exposure to health risks. The poor population's vulnerability, living in these urban areas, will be exacerbated by exposure to severe weather events and lack of ability to adapt to these risks. Now, rising sea levels make cities vulnerable to drastic environmental changes and definitely exacerbate the economic risks faced by their urban residents. Inland cities, for example, also have susceptibilities to climate change, including urban settlements, unslip slopes, and hazard-prone areas, and the heat island effects. Sea level rise and other coastal implications, such as changes in storm frequency, put populations at risk of climate change effects. So the rapid urbanization experienced in the 20th century and the expansion observed today has already created over 20 coastal megacities. In contrast, in the 90s, there were a total of 7 coastal megacities in Asia, excluding Japan, and 2 in South America. So the fragility of the sedimentary strata where the megacities are located, in this case, is a concern. And this concern adds to the climate change impacts on urban populations. So the repercussions of climate change on cities are varied and require each city to have an independent assessment, an assessment to mitigate and adapt to climate change health risks. Now, among cities, in our case study for this presentation, we can actually say that the city of New York is vulnerable to mid-latitude cyclones and other type of events of that nature, which reach a peak in November to April. So coastal erosion is increasing and makes the city defenseless against coastal flooding. Rio de Janeiro, for example, which is another city that we are presenting today, has a climate change factor that other coastal cities share. The rise in sea level will have a variety of impacts: flooding, sanitation issues, quality and quantity of water resources. And then Los Angeles. It has developed a comprehensive adaptation and mitigation plan and conducted a pioneer study of the impact of climate change in the country. It can serve as an example to other cities around the world. So these initiatives help to create a solid strategy to address the cost of inaction to climate change impacts on health, and the focus is on the health effects of severe climatic events and preventive actions to reduce the burden of disease. And one of the other cities under the case study presentation is Beijing, assessing heat-related mortalities, the urban heat island effect on its residents, and air pollution issues that are becoming a major concern for climate change mitigation strategists in this city. So now, all this presentation, the research involved, present a risk management framework that fits the urban settings. And this provides additional insights as to how cities can prepare, develop, and implement risk management structures, strategic planning, and sustainable management systems to deal with climate change issues. Now we're going to move to the next slide. Poverty is an important factor
that adds to the health effects of climate change on populations. So poverty, climate, and public health are closely related. The insufficient access to healthcare for the poor, for example, for the urban dwellers, is detrimental to the poor's susceptibility to drastic weather events. So the risk of displacement is another factor of climate change for the poor, and the risk of disease is even much higher. Therefore, pre-existing conditions and situations increase the stress and vulnerability of the urban dweller to these extreme events and make them much more vulnerable. And also another factor that has to be highly considered stresses the healthcare system as well, with the lack of resources and tools to treat people within that dimension. So the rapid increase of poverty in urban centers, particularly in megacities, is a particular characteristic of urban expansion. In many developing countries, the population of the urban poor is increasing in higher proportions than the overall population grows. This disparity results in more inequalities and economic and social injustice. Once again, putting a lot of stress onto the healthcare system. So poverty, climate, and public health are intertwined, as I said before, and their synergies have a counter effect that threatens sustainable development. Now we're going to go to the next. In this section, we're going to be talking about climate-sensitive vector-borne diseases. So in general, climate plays an important role in the seasonal pattern or temporal distribution of the disease that are carried out and transmitted through vectors because the vector animals often thrive in particular climate conditions. Let's give an example. Warm and wet environments are excellent places for mosquitoes to breed, right? If those breeding mosquitoes happen to be species that can transmit disease, and if there is an infected population in the region, then the disease is more likely to spread in that particular area, obviously. So because the vectors are sensitive to climate, their distribution and numbers are already being altered by climate change. So in essence, the environmental effects of a changing climate include compromised water supplies, decreased air quality, diminished food security, as we know, and also it has a direct effect on vectors. Therefore, altered precipitation patterns could change the population density of vector-borne diseases, infecting residents in greater numbers and affecting the health of entire communities. This is a very important topic to talk about because we need to understand disease outbreak and its relation with climate change. So climate is a key determinant of health. Climate constrains the range of infection diseases, while weather affects the timing and intensity of outbreaks. So a long-term warming trend is encouraging the geographic expansion of several important infections, while extreme weather events are spawning clusters, I should say, of disease, in sparking a series of surprises or shocks. Ecological changes and economic inequities strongly influence disease patterns, but a warming and unstable climate is playing an ever-increasing role in driving the global emergence, resurgence, and distribution of infection diseases. So, after this analysis, there's a clear evidence of the relation between climate change, health risk, and the long-term consequences to the global population. And we talk about the globalization of many diseases like Chagas disease, or how malaria is now being is affecting the urban population. So disease outbreak in uncontrollable proportions disrupts lives and displaces millions of people, forcing them to migrate. So the ability to stop what is happening will continue to decrease if world leaders do not take action. It is nearly impossible to roll back the clock or even slow changes that are already in the system. The increase of diseases that we are witnessing in certain regions is evidence of how climate change affects the outbreak of disease. And that's being reported by McMichael and many research even back from the 2000s, 2002, 2003, and is still very alive today. An argument can be presented because there is an urgent need to adapt and subsequently mitigate climate change impacts. So if we tied up all these topics, issues, risks, health, mitigation, and adaptation, we can have a very solid case to present a concrete, sustainable management program for cities. Now, although many major cities around the world are already acting upon climate change effects on health, and I'm very cautious about this, an immediate action plan is urgent, and it needs to include a comprehensive health risk assessment, which is totally absent. Assessment cannot predict the future per se, so caution needs to guide the process while we are developing and implementing this particular strategic planning, when developing and implementing risk management in particular to mitigate climate change effects. So approximations and likely impact indicators of climate change effects on health can be acceptable. That will be a great start and allow us to be more concise in our approach to a sustainable management and strategic planning to climate health in cities. Now, projecting the health impacts of climate change, it is a big challenge, simply because overall we live in a society where a reactive approach is acceptable. And that's a fact. So adaptation strategies can include and implement a risk management plan addressing the health impacts of climate change, which are essential in order to protect and develop a realistic framework that is feasible to protect the city's urban populations. So therefore, the long-term impacts of climate change needs to be addressed in order to develop a comprehensive risk management framework. Populations at risk are also considered in these projections, as we stated before, projections of climate change-related health impacts. So the economic situation of the population in the region it needs to be analyzed. But we have to make sure they are directly related to disease burdens, because climate change health risks and the gross domestic product are determined by different causes, such as climate, and environmental and social factors. I'm not a fan of the GDP. I don't think it's an accurate form of measuring an economy, any economy, developed or developing countries. But that's what we have today. And there are some tools and some other measures out there that are getting traction, let's say. So in essence, when we do this type of assessments on disease outbreak and climate, the well-being and good health of the population is determined by factors other than income per capita. Therefore, the increased per capita income does not improve the health of populations. Let's move to the next section. Now we are going to be talking about urban health challenges and urban populations. So the urban environments of densely populated cities are already exposed to health-threatening conditions. So the cost of major environmental changes due to this growing population in cities is closely related to urbanization and therefore an increase in public health risks. So massive urban growth is also parallel to urban poverty. We established that. So the reasons include the absence of urban planning, as we said, regulatory institutions, etc. So these gaps definitely needs to be addressed. So developing countries in general are experiencing a fast and extended urbanizations as cities are becoming common in low and middle income countries. In many developing countries, the proportion of urban poor is increasing faster than the overall rate of population growth. So as a result, the capacity of cities to provide the necessary service like healthcare services is being challenged by this rapid urban growth. Now, in regards of poverty, I think we need to have a different working definition. So what I'm saying, we need a different working definition of poverty that definitely encompasses and portrays the urban dwellers' needs, their personal and financial struggles, and we address these struggles with empathy. And empathy and policy making are correlated. They really are. You really have to put a human face in these issues. And that's what I mean when I said we need a fresh working definition of poverty. Because if you don't tie up a human aspect of the issue, any issue, could be gun violence, could be diseases, could be income. If you don't do that, you won't have the tools. You won't be able to develop the skills to tackle the issue. Cognitive skills are important. Knowledge is important. Awareness is important. But when you hear from the people who are suffering, and then you can actually come out with something concrete, and is actually able to impact the people that you want to help. So, in regards of the urban dwellers, in this drastic, I should say, expansion of cities and its population, it put a lot of pressure on the health services. And these services are becoming increasingly complex. And as the lack of resources increases, the pressure to provide efficient care to the urban dwellers is stressed and compromised. Now, this lack of efficient care to the urban dwellers, this lack is implicit in this term. It's called underdevelopment. And to cite a sociologist, a French sociologist, Alain Touraine, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, he called it maldevelopment. So this term carries a qualitative notion that refers to a discrepancy between the needs of a specific population and the response generated to help this population. So maldevelopment is visible in our cities. Why is that? Ta-da-da-da! Well, I tell you why. It's due to poor urban planning and definitely a lack of adequate policies. I'm pointing at the city leaders now. I'm pointing out the urban leaders. Adequate policies that fit the needs of the population. So these urban environments present new problems that coexist with old ones as the public health risks and the inequalities increase. So therefore, the accumulation of dispossession becomes a common denominator in the healthcare system in developing countries. When dealing with the urban dwellers, and particularly the urban poor, coexist. Very few resources are available, right, in these particular situations and conditions, and distributed to the poor. So they lack adequate services to manage health risks. Therefore, the growth of slums and the presence of climate change impacts present a new challenge that the health sector needs to act upon. Let me give you an example. For example, dengue fever, which was an epidemic illness at the beginning of the 21st century, is becoming an endemic urban disease. Once again, it's becoming an endemic urban disease associated with these problems. And that was cited by Julio Frank, former Harvard School of Public Health Dean and now president of the University of Miami, who I have the pleasure to know, and I have been invited to the lecture over there as well. He has done great study. He was the head of the health sector in Mexico years ago. So his experience is highly valuable. So therefore, just to finish the sentence, as prevention is the core of public health, we talk about that, right? Let's be proactive instead of reactive. So prevention is the core of public health. The impact of climate change in the urban population can be minimized through early action and deterrent measures. Let's go to the next section. Now we're going to start with the second part of the presentation, which is called Turning Theory into Reality. I put emphasis on pragmatism. We need to be pragmatic, right? To develop, implement, and apply strategic planning towards these risk events. And the reason being is because we might have an efficient application of disaster health risk reduction policies and strategies to prevent new public health risks. And we also need to understand that we must reduce existing health risk and manage residual risk, contributing to the strengthening of cities' health systems' resilience. And with that, we'll be developing a set of facilities and systems that can identify those risks and allow us to be better prepared for the assessment of the risk management to climate impacts on health. And they are strategic analysis. How short and long-term climate impacts will affect the city's operations? The risks associated with the impacts are categorized into crucial groups that we're going to be listing later on with examples of the current and anticipated risk associated with climate change. Then technical capabilities. So the city's technical capabilities is vulnerable to climate variability and change. This risk is predicted to accelerate due to both sea level rise and the intensity and frequency of the storms. In this case, in cities located in coastal areas. Furthermore, the city's facilities are also at risk, several of which are especially vulnerable to many impacts like flooding, sea level rise, storm surges, etc. So for cities leadership, it is becoming important to acquire and provide data and knowledge to inform decision making. This capability may be threatened by impact to physical facilities, right? So then city employees supporting the development and delivery of data and knowledge are essential to minimize the impact of climate events. They are also in charge of addressing the impacts to supply chains that may present risk to the city's capabilities and accesses, particularly if access to specific materials or chemicals is affected, which definitely poses a high risk of environmental and health risk to the population. So the technical capabilities of a city, which are vulnerable to climate impacts, needs a coordinated effort from city leaders and the city employees that support the development and delivery of certain services, specific services like data centers and other settings and infrastructures and departments that are essential for the functioning of the city. And also we need to focus on built systems. So the susceptibility of many systems across the city's infrastructure is exposed during a severe weather event. So let's say energy, communications, and information technology systems are vulnerable to storms that are increasing in intensity and frequency. Heat wave, for example, presents another detrimental effect where electrical blackouts threaten the energy sector utilities that provide the power any city uses to receive, process, and archive data and provide electricity to the population. Also, heavy precipitations may overwhelm stormwater current systems, creating flooding that affects buildings and transportation systems and limits the ability of the city workforce to perform the duties to maintain a continuity business approach for the city's operations. So pretty much the whole city is a halt. Everything stopped working. And when we don't have a risk management, continuity management system approach for the continuation of the system to keep operating in normal conditions, definitely the city is in trouble. And obviously affects the population as a whole. But then the workforce and communities play a factor into this equation. Health risk and safety impacts to the population may pose operational risks. The population health can also be detrimentally affected by worsening air quality, heat waves, or problems caused by disease-borne vectors. Moreover, the personnel providing the necessary support to the city's operation is at risk and will not be ready to operate under these circumstances. So all these factors need to be considered throughout the assessment in the application of disaster health risk reduction policies. And lastly, natural systems. Wildfires are an increased threat to natural and built systems, and we are experiencing this today in California and in many other places around the world. Wetland losses due to increased storm surges impacts may affect the safeguarding effect that shields some of those facilities. The communication network, the road and trail, and the rail networks, and the housing developments as well. So increasing rainstorms and fluctuating groundwater tables may mobilize contaminants and consequently put the residents at the health risk state. Now, the consideration that we need to be taken and be part of the strategy are the following. So what are the principal climate variables that drive and constrain the transportation, as well as the water and energy sector, health, and food availability? What are the principal impacts of the identified key climate variables and processes on transport, water, energy, health, and food, which are crucial for the city's operation? What are the interactions between various impacts and how do they contribute to a city's aerosol and greenhouse gas emissions? Is it possible to detect thresholds for an impact of climate variables on the urban subsystems? So, there are specific key climate hazards and potential impacts. And they are, for key climate hazards, more frequent and extreme high temperatures and humidity. The potential impact of it is the increased risk of heat-related ailments, particularly outdoors, higher cooling cost, decreased utility reliability, and damage to buildings. Another key climate hazard is more frequent and intense droughts and seasonal shifts in water cycle. The impact would be reduced water availability, higher water cost, saltwater intrusion, and groundwater changes. Key climate hazards, more intense precipitation events. Potential impacts, more frequent flooding. Sea level rise as a climate hazard, and for the potential impact, loss of usable land, inundations. For the climate hazard, more frequent and intense coastal flood. The potential impact is coastal erosion, safety implications for events in surrounding communities. And that is taken from the NASA Climate Risk Management Plan. Now, for all these events that affect the city and how we can actually efficiently apply and reduce existing health risks, we need to have a very comprehensive plan that requires a team of experts. And this team of experts on the ground, they are actually in charge of developing and implementing a management system that includes policy, people with defined responsibilities, management process related to the policy, the planning, the implementation, and operations. They do performance assessments, they do management review of the situation, and they apply continual improvement, which is part of a risk management framework, to the strategy applied. And it's very important when we talk about turning theory into reality. So when we develop the continuity management system, we have to establish important point of actions that determine how the city will preserve or restore critical functions. So the city's quick resumption of normal operations after a disaster event will affect the entire city recovery and obviously the welfare of its residents. And now we're going to move to the next slide. An assessment of the potential future health impacts of climate change for the city is crucial. It's crucial to evaluate the situation, the present situation, understand a future impact to the city and its populations. And in general, a risk assessment is a very important tool because it needs to be part, I should say an integral part, of the strategic management approach. The assessment will help us to create awareness of the risk, of the hazards, identify who may be at risk. Could be the population in general, a certain sector of the population, a certain demographics, senior citizens, children, etc. Or the buildings, the infrastructure, the power grid, the water system. So that help us evaluate and have a clear picture of what's really going on in front of us. And also will determine whether a control program is required for a particular hazard or risk. Now, there are certain steps that we need to take to move forward with an assessment of the potential health impacts. So, first of all, developing an evaluation of the potential future effects of climate change on health can provide a valuable tool to forecast and address these risks. And in consequence, the risks associated with climate variability and change. So the framework, in general terms, for this particular assessment has to highlight issues presented by climate change according to the region, health outcomes, and the adaptation as well. So the challenges and limitations faced by developing a comprehensive evaluation include the following issues. So, and that's what I'm going to be naming. Let's start with the limited region-specific projections of changes and exposure of importance to human health. So those limitations on projections are very important to understand because it can also give us a good look of what we have in front of us, but also give us a strong sense of the limitations that we have and how we can maximize the tools that we have to deal with the confronted risk. So the considerations of multiple, interacting, and multi-causal health outcomes is also another factor. The difficulty of attributing health outcomes to climate or climate change per se. It is quite challenging, particularly if we talk about policy making. I wrote several policy briefs for the public and the private sector, and I teach this particular subject in class as well. So it's very difficult, very challenging to use the right, let's say, words, the right text, and elaborate these issues because you have to also consider the audience as well. So if the audience is not, let's say, educated, informed about climate health risk, so you have to use a different approach. And it's very difficult. Sometimes the message get lost. So how you attach these health outcomes to climate climate change per se, right? Well, like we said. So you have to be very specific, but not to give enough details to confuse the listener, and at the same time to have pragmatic approaches and strategies in place so everybody can understand it and apply it, which is the most important thing. So the difficulty of generalizing health outcomes from one setting to another when many diseases like malaria, we were talking about, right, have important local transmission, or I should say transmission dynamics that cannot easily be represented in simple relationships, limited inclusion of different developmental scenarios and health projections. All these are obstacles that can actually deter the vision and the objective that we have. Another thing is definitely related to what I just said, the difficulty in identifying climate-related thresholds for population health, and the limited understanding of the extent, rate, limiting forces, and major drivers of adaptation of human populations to a changing climate. On the next section, we're going to move to how we can actually assess disease outbreak and climate change. Climate change is a particularly difficult issue to address. First, there is a sheer scope of it. While weather at the local level may be consistent, hotter or colder, it is affected by change happening on a global level. Second, those who caused most of the emissions, the majority of the emissions that led to this situation, are not willing to pay a proportional share of the cost to mitigate the climate changes caused by their generational actions. Last, the uncertainty of what will actually happen leads many country leaders and city leaders as well to pause before investing, since the timing of catastrophic climate impacts is uncertain. So, in general, solving large complex problems is often left for future generations. Those of us in the business of climate change, we can say, feel that kicking the can down the road for future generations to address this issue is not a viable solution. So definitely the time to act is now. And we need several forward-thinking city mayors spurred into action by witnessing the effects of climate change on their cities firsthand. So, and then they decide to act. Will they? Now, in regards of cities, we can really say that they have an intricate response to the impacts of climate change on the health of the populations. Their reactions in general, and I'm talking about city leaders too, of course, their reactions are due to the unpreparedness of the public and the authorities in dealing with the consequences of it. Therefore, the ability of a city to develop adaptation strategies is restrained by the inability of the city leaders to make collective decisions, resulting in a lack of coordinated efforts and government inaction. I definitely think that the predicament is clear. It's clear to see and straightforward to recognize, but hard to unravel. Despite the economic success of cities, megacities around the world, particularly in the 21st century, their leaders are still seeking solutions to the health consequences of climate change. They are trying to determine what the impacts are for the urban population, how to respond with preparedness and adaptation strategies, and what collective actions are available to reduce the health risks associated with climatic events. Climate change is a major concern that is closely related to our good health. Today, it presents health risks even more profound than those posed by poor sanitation and living conditions in 19th century London. A population's health depends on environmental stability and the functioning of the world's climate systems. In the next decades, most cities will experience the impact of climate change, and major cities around the world will gradually face the consequences. The increase in risk factors will put the lives and safety of billions of people in jeopardy, but the threat will affect the population unequally. Climate change will compound existing vulnerabilities, increase poverty levels, and affect the urban population, because they typically live in the most vulnerable areas of the city. So the urban dwellers, the poor section of society, are definitely much more susceptible to these impacts, and they are at risk from the effect of changing climate and natural disasters. Overcrowded living conditions, inaccessibility to safe infrastructure, and poor health conditions make the urban poor, in this case, highly susceptible to the impacts of climate change. A changing climate can alter the pattern of diseases, mortality, human settlement, food, water, and sanitation. Climate change brings increasing temperatures, rising seas, and more frequent incidents of severe storms. These effects produce dangerous sanitary events and are known as health risks. In addition, shifting rainfall patterns may influence transmission of many diseases, including water-related illnesses such as diarrhea and vector-borne infections, as we visited in previous slides for this lecture. Finally, climate change could have far-reaching effects on how food is produced and may have health impacts from increasing rate of malnutrition. So there we go again. So the ability of a city to develop strategies is restrained by the inability of city leaders to make collective decisions. And we are paying the consequences today. Let's move to the next section. To continue coming from the previous slide to dealing with climate health impacts in your city, we'll be talking about an effective response to climate health events. Start quantifying. So what that is while you're developing your strategy, you need to develop specific tasks. And they are: you need to work with climate scientists to improve regional climate change projections. So you have to enhance the understanding of the potential impact of climate change on the department's operations within your city. Determine and implement appropriate adaptations to water systems. Number 4, inventory and manage greenhouse gas emissions. And number 5, improve communications and tracking mechanisms. So the action plan includes 2 primary priorities for further study. So the first priority needs to conduct a phased integrated modeling project to quantify and provide a more comprehensive understanding of the potential impacts of climate change. Impacts on drinking water, supply, demand, etc. So the second priority is to conduct an integrated modeling that could be inundation, flood mapping, and cost-benefit analysis to quantify and provide a more comprehensive understanding of the potential impacts of climate change on drainage, wastewater treatment, and infrastructure as well. So with that, we can actually say that there are a series of activities that we can propose. We can propose the implementation of a strategy to cope efficiently with such impacts. Therefore, we're going to name 4. They're very specific in nature and must be tailored to the strategic planning for the city. Quantify immediate to medium-term physical, economic, and environmental and social outcomes resulting from selected weather events. Characterize, as a second phase, vulnerability by examining the trends in impact indicators. Number 3, characterize responses in terms of cost, distributional effects, and efficiency. And number 4, identify opportunities and means for incorporating climate health risks into local and regional decision-making. We are going to move to the next section now. In this slide, we'll be talking about sustainable urbanization and city leaders, a model for change. We need to understand something that for me is quite clear. Leadership is the starting point of strategy. Leadership is the starting point of strategy. So from that concept, the role of leadership, the role of leaders within the city must be tailored with any type of comprehensive assessment program, strategic approach, policies, projects, etc. Reason being is because leaders inspire. Not only they inspire people, as we know in our society, but they also inspire actions, and action within the system that they work with. They motivate people enough, I should say, to make changes, because leaders embrace change. Now, if we talk about urbanization in general, and we talk about processes, we can definitely tailor on any type of adaptation or strategic approach to climate, health, and urban areas, a health impact assessment, policies, plans, and projects, right? And we need to incorporate climate change information and projections into city policies, plans, and codes. Definitely we need to be using adaptation strategies that present a co-benefit for the health of city residents. But all these needs to be tailored to leadership, exemplary leadership. And as I said, leadership as the starting point of your strategy. And that's why city leaders and cities as a whole, as engines of economic growth and the engines of could be environmental stewardship, as well as good examples of what sustainability really means, they need to be a model for change. So cities and their leaders can serve as a model for change, in essence. The promotion of innovative ideas, mitigation, adaptation plans for climate change, environmental efficiency, risk management approaches, frameworks that contribute to the well-being of the urban population will enhance an already established management plan, right? But we also enable prosperity through economic development. So coming from this assessment, cities have the opportunity to cope with climate change with local changes that have a global impact. Cities start locally and impact globally. That translates into a tangible approach to acting quickly to climate change events between residents and city leaders. So, therefore, the development of a set of common adaptive strategic measures with a focus on climate-related disasters creates the potential for cities to consider a strategic plan that brings the strategy under a universal framework. So, back in the days when I was a student, I used to think this way, and I presented something like this, like what if we have a universal framework? So what would we have a step-by-step process, elements that we can put together, but every single city, organization, entity, private or public sector can actually use, and then it can be a carbon copy. It can be projected to other cities and also other organizations and they can use it as a framework, as the foundation for their strategy. And at the same time, this particular universal framework must be adaptable and flexible enough, right? Because circumstances, geography, social economic outcomes all play a factor of how the city can cope and be resilient towards these particular risks. So in this case, I definitely believe that cities have an opportunity to cope on a greater scale with these risks, and also can be a model for change and can implement a universal framework that can be copied by other sectors of society. Now, I should say that in regards of climate leadership within cities, there are some networks, some entities that, like the C40 City Group, the C40 Network of Cities, Michael Bloomberg, former New York mayor, is a good example of one of those leaders who make a lot of transformations, right, in strategies. Also, while he was in office, and outside his job as a mayor, also he led several strategies in regards of climate change and the role of cities. So, in that regards, there have been many good movements and actions towards these issues. So, because these cities emit approximately, according to the numbers that I remember on top of my head, like about 300 million tons of carbon dioxide per year, or more. I think we reach 400. But nonetheless, somebody can correct me about those statistics. Nonetheless, the transport sector is critical to the CO2 emission reduction program of the C40 group. 17 of the 36 responding cities have already implemented a comprehensive plan to reduce CO2 emissions. Cities that are members of the C40 group. So the relation between population density in these big cities, many are megacities, and the levels of per capita carbon emissions from transport indicates that some urban areas have a more harmful impact on the environment than others. So higher population densities can translate into lower transport emissions, for example, and the correlation between GDP, gross domestic product, and per capita emissions from transport in this particular C40 cities group is also acknowledged. Continuing with the transportation sector, or I should say transportation emissions, all the population density in major cities and transport emissions clearly are related. The statistics acquired in some studies show that many disparities among cities around the world are in effect. Some of the highest per capita GDP are in the cities of London, Hong Kong, New York, for example, right? So, however, they have relatively low per capita carbon emissions in comparison to other cities. The reason is that some cities with high population density use an efficient and widespread public transportation system. So they came a long way in regards of being sustainable in these regards. But in general, the highest carbon emission due to transport are in the cities with high GDPs. And conversely, the cities with the lowest GDPs tend to have lower emissions. Going back to the C40 group, there is a C40 group of mayors. Now we are talking about city leaders, which is the topic of this particular section. So they work together towards a common goal, and that's great. So they could make a substantial impact, and they have been making a substantial impact on reducing environmental damage, health effects, in the deterioration of urban systems. I don't really recall health as a very major topic of their strategy. Nonetheless, of course, if we have a sustainable transport, that will impact the health of the population. So these particular groups of mayors, they have the power and influence to mitigate the consequences of GHG emissions from transportation and other sources as well. So going back to the city leaders as a model for change, mayors who have control of city budgets and resources can act to have a relatively immediate impact on initiatives. Some cities have already taken initiatives, we all know that, and depending on their success, other cities will follow. So definitely leading by example and learning from experience from other cities and city leaders is an important factor to achieve our goals. However, depending on their success, other cities will follow, I said, but in cities where mayors, have neither the power nor the resources to make changes in initiative projects, this cannot be accomplished. If mayors have control of municipal assets such as roads and pavements, they can move forward, right, with transformative initiatives through direct projects and programs. But accordingly, these programs are often backed up by the regulations and policies. So, for example, infrastructure initiatives led by mayors demonstrate that they are capable of using their power efficiently and promptly, act quickly to collectively accelerate emission reductions. And this is definitely a good sign. It shows us the power of mayors. Mayors can act faster than many other officials, including head of states, to move quickly to pragmatic, tangible strategies to cope with climate, health, and the issues that the urban dwellers deal with. So the urgency for cities to mitigate a changing climate is more crucial today than ever. Some cities' contribution to emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are greater than many other nations together. Let's talk about some metrics. So New York City, for example, emits 63.1 metric tons of CO2, equivalent to climate change, right? So this number is only 10% lower than the contribution of all of the country of Ireland emissions. And this data came from 2011 and more research in 2018. So now, in regards of greenhouse gas emission reduction, it requires a set of strategic plans that are integrated towards a common goal. It can be very effective in minimizing carbon emissions when we have strategic steps to reduce these emissions, such as energy efficiency in buildings and reducing traffic and car use on the roads. Those are effective in lessening a city's carbon footprint, though we know that. So strategies for cities to develop and implement their infrastructure, for example, in a sustainable way, will be crucial to combating climate change and will determine the future path of its success. Los Angeles is a good example of it. I did interview people under the Villaraigosa mayor more than a decade ago here in LA, and they were already involved in many strategic sustainable paths and programs to make the city greener with some success. Now let's move to the next section. Risk assessment framework concerns. So this lecture or presentation proves that implementation of adaptation and mitigation risk management framework for climate change and health has many benefits. Concerns and questions, however, remain regarding the challenges for many cities in executing a risk management plan. Further research and policy development is necessary to address those issues in order to prevent potential risks due to climate change. So these actions raise ethical questions about the level of government involvement. What combination of stakeholders should prioritize the initiatives and consequently the implementation of climate change strategies? Considering that the awareness of the effects of a changing climate is low among vulnerable sectors of society, and that the uncertainty of issues related to climate change at the local level is still high, cities face challenges in addressing the specific needs of the most vulnerable sections of its inhabitants, the urban poor. Developing an assessment considering all factors of climate change, impacts on health and potential risks, in addition to adaptive resilience and mitigation strategies that are not mere recommendations and reports, but instead direct tangible actions towards the problem, is vital for the success of any risk assessment framework. Get the boots on the ground. Clearly, the absence of a city climate change strategy will exacerbate climate change impacts on health, accentuating the risks to the urban poor. Crafting a flexible and calibrated approach for building resilience and preparing social institutions for public health or disaster management programs to be retrofitted to adapt to climate change are important elements for city leaders to employ. So now, strategies that work from vertical coordination among national and local policy efforts must be emphasized. Promoting horizontal collaboration among a city's different departments and between global cities in a joint action has to be encouraged as well to get tangible results. Moving on to the next chapter for this presentation, we're going to be talking about climate risk management. We're going to be talking about strategies. We're going to be talking about concrete solutions that can be applied on a policy-making level, can be applied on a city level where city leaders can actually have a pragmatic approach to these issues. I'm very excited about this part of the presentation, simply because we can talk about the issues. I say this quite often, actually. We can talk about the issues all day long. Many people out there have the knowledge, the skills, the education, you name it, to talk about the issues, to talk about what's really going on. But how we can translate, materialize all that knowledge, all that research into a practical approach. Dr. John Kotter from Harvard Business School told me once, for the record, he is an emeritus professor at Harvard, and he wrote several books about strategy, business, and he's a best-selling author as well. He told me once, many of us can write books, but not many of us can write a good book, a useful book. So that's key right there. So we can gather research and we can gather so much information nowadays. but at the same time, we need to utilize that information and our skills to have a systematic analysis of that and a management approach to health risk through a well-planned strategic approach to integrating recovery measures, preventing and mitigating health risk, and identifying population vulnerabilities. Those are our priority for not only the health sector to lessen public health risk impacts, but also for society as a whole. So all the approaches that I'll be presenting deal explicitly or implicitly with the question, how do we apply and deliver concrete strategies to confront the vulnerabilities of cities, systematic vulnerabilities, people's vulnerabilities, of attaining sustainable development, capacity building, proactive and reactive strategic planning, and improving and maintaining the city's infrastructure and services, that is crucial, to sustain resilience. I was invited to the Climate and Health Symposium in Atlanta back in 2017. And many experts right there, spoke about climate and health, bridging the link, and talking about the issues. And many colleagues and friends of mine, Dr. Andy Haynes, for example, he's been working on climate health for decades. And I had the pleasure to see him there, but also to meet him while I was attending the university, and he helped me in many research papers that I conducted. And many others. Former Vice President Al Gore was there. So a lot of knowledgeable people, but nonetheless, I think the message, for the most part, can easily get lost. Simply because when we talk about climate change, particularly in a polarized society that we live here in the U.S., and I believe we are living in a very polarized world, the message can get lost, and the importance and severity and urgency of the topic can actually fade out. So that's why when I talk about these issues, and I said that over there, I talk about risk. Why is that? Because risk is usually characterized by events and the consequences of those events: climate change, public health risk, pandemic. So uncertainty, it's a lack of information that makes it difficult to understand the event and its consequences or its livelihoods. Now, if we move into public health, health risk is the population's susceptibility and degree of exposure to hazards, right? So health risk can be described as a change of loss and or variability from health and worsening of ill health. Now, with all these challenges in front of us, we need to identify potential opportunities and then manage and take action to prevent those adverse effects, all around risk. In that context, when you talk about risk, immediately you have to think about strategy. So a well-rounded strategy can predict the future or the forecast rather of events of the city, for the city, or also it can be applied to any organization, good enough to choose a clear strategic direction for it by applying a set of powerful analytical tools. And that what is missing in adaptation and mitigation programs around the world, particularly in cities. So personally, climate change creates an uncertain future for cities, right? So we understand that. So approaching the strategic plan underestimating uncertainty can lead to a lack of strategic vision in concrete terms. To let's say to advance the goals that we are seeking, that we would like to achieve, and objectives of the strategy making. So when we see see these vulnerabilities against these threats, while if we are overlooking those opportunities, that give us definitely a disruptive vision and a broken strategic approach to these issues. I could say also that, according to my experience working in the private sector for so many years, another danger lies at the other extreme, let's say. If managers, if leaders cannot find a strategy that works under traditional analysis, they may abandon the analytical rigor of their planning process altogether and base their decisions in gut instinct. Let me be clear about that. Many decisions are reactive and they are short-lived. We are here to present a long-term strategic approach for climate health, risk, and cities. Now we're going to move to the next section. When building a risk management framework to tackle climate change health risk and urban settings, we need to establish the context and setting objectives. To set the objectives of a risk management assessment, the location and the scope of the study and the operating processes in the area under threat have to be established. Therefore, an assessment seeks to identify and investigate risks to describe the actions that are required to attain the following objectives. And they are the potential impact on a particular value, and thirdly, a threatening process, heat wave, sea level rise, etc. As a consequence, the economic, social, and environmental values of the land where the strategic framework applies must also be included in the assessment. Therefore, risk criteria are also important considerations for the framework. Livelihoods and consequences scales, those are very common words in risk management, and we use it constantly. Livelihoods and consequences, and that's how we measure impact for the most part. In their combination in the current conditions might be included when defining the acceptable risk level. City leaders and stakeholders should determine what the level is and then identify tolerable and intolerable risks, giving priority to the latter, that need to be addressed according to local conditions. There are some risks that we cannot tolerate, we cannot treat. So we have to give priorities to the ones that we can actually cope with. Risk modeling techniques are increasingly used by many governmental entities, particularly on the cybersecurity, cyber terrorism area, because they evaluate exposure to disasters and crises. So they're very useful, and they can definitely be used for cities on climate change impacts and public health risk. So assessing and comparing different types of risk from adverse impacts becomes fundamental in understanding and minimizing their impacts and recovering quickly after the event's occurrence on the balance of probabilities. Now, recovering quickly after the event's occurrence. Now we are talking about business continuity management system, which we'll be addressing in the following sections. But that is how we can be better prepared to recover quickly and have an operating system back again after a disaster. So there are three central risk modeling techniques inputs. and they are hazards. So climate events impacting a city can potentially present uncertainties about its hazard occurrences in the affecting area exposure. So existing knowledge of past events on a local or global context afford a tangible concept of the intensity and frequency of what is expected. Now, we have to be careful about that because past events cannot dictate, neither forecast what is coming, future events. So we can learn from the past, get better prepared, have a proactive approach to it, but that won't be 100% effective to wherever it's coming. So they can guide us, but it's not going to be an efficient treatment of the risk. And then exposure. Location and geographical distribution of the territory that will be affected by a hazard needs to be mapped. An account of human occupation and physical assets has to be performed. Particular components as of geometric shape of exposed elements, economic value, human occupation, and location, they must be identified to differentiate the exposure. And lastly, vulnerability. We talk extensively about vulnerability because it is important for this analysis. So exposed elements, susceptibility, or probable conduct is directly linked to the level of hazard. Natural hazards can be differentiated and analyzed by the intensity and the frequency of the impact. Hazard parameters can be established by analyzing and understanding past records of events and risk modeling and its probabilities. The nature, magnitude, frequency, and intensity can help determine the level of the hazard. The World Bank has conducted many research about that. Consequently, hazard models, which are based on a set of assumptions that should be conveyed to the model user, may present a reasonable account of complex environmental dynamics and evolution as well, addressing many factors such as urbanization and climate change. Now, to finalize it, the socioeconomic trends, the trends assisting populations that can also show their exposure to vulnerabilities can provide a clearer picture of the risk. So these socioeconomic trends can guide us to have a vision for what is coming to us. Climatic events such as severe weather events and climate change affect hazard characteristics. Therefore, analysis of the long-term socioeconomic scenarios of the city is essential for an understanding of the probabilities and the risk assessment of vulnerabilities while considering important factors such as urbanization and economic growth, lifestyle changes, and also demographics. And that's all for this particular section, and we go and jump onto the next. We are going to address what a proactive approach really means rather than being reactive, confronting risk. In the private world, many organizations do have continuity management systems, particularly in cybersecurity, but that can expand to many other types of risks. So a continuity management system must be part of your strategy. If you think strategically, you think about continuity. So as a city leader, you should ask yourself the following questions. What would happen if your city was involved in a severe event? Would the city survive the crisis? How would you ensure that your city endures the disaster? So continuity management systems are about preparing an organization, a city and urban setting, an entity, local, global, to deal with disruptive incidents that might otherwise prevent it from achieving its objectives. Therefore, the international standard ISO 22301, there are many international standards as we know, but this particular one that deals with a proactive approach to risk and how we can continue operating after the drastic event, specifies requirements to plan, establish, implement, operate, monitor, review, maintain, and continually improve a documented management system to protect against, reduce the livelihood of, prepare for, respond to, and recover from disruptive incidents when they arise. So this particular international standard, and for the record, it can be modified. It can be, because it is adaptable. So it doesn't have to be specifically the step-by-step process of the ISO 22301 or any other updated ISO. You can actually integrate this particular guideline into your strategy. So this international standard can significantly reduce risk, particularly when a lack of awareness and a concrete strategy in your continuity management plan after disaster or impact is present. It also provides flexibility of implementation, I just said that, so you can actually adapt it and make it flexible to your needs. Identifying what is most relevant to minimize financial loss, death, infrastructure, communications, health impacts. It can be used by the healthcare system as well, communities, and the overall operations of the city. The effects of climate change on cities will be handled by the corresponding emergency services. We know that. But do we know what will happen next? So emergency services are a reactive operating system. They are a reactive element, part of the disaster management department of the city. And they actually act after the event. But do we know what will happen next? Managing a city's overall continuity of operations becomes a priority in any time of severe weather event, as do implementing and operating controls and executing strategies for treating those risks. Any number of events can bring the city to a grinding halt, and business continuity management planning will ensure that the municipal leaders will respond accordingly to the circumstances. A continuity management approach contributes to a more resilient society. Now, the following key components are considered vital when developing and implementing a continuity management system plan. And they are policy, people with defined responsibilities. So we need leaders in each department of the jurisdiction within the city, strategy and operations, management processes that are related to policy planning, implementation and operation, performance assessments, management review, and continual improvement. And we also need documentation providing auditable evidence. So the audits are very important. We need to audit our system to make sure there are no gaps, there are no disruptions that could be very detrimental during an event. So auditing is quite important and has to be part of the program. And of course, any business continuity management process that is relevant to the organization. Now, the key question is how we're going to resume normal operations after a disaster. So there are 10 important points of action that have to be part of your risk management approach to climate health risk and cities. So these 10 important points that I'm going to mention of action determine how the city will preserve or restore critical functions. So the city's quick resumption of normal operations after a severe weather event will affect the entire city's recovery and the welfare of the city's residents. And here they are. Establish an emergency planning team. Workers from all levels and departments must be included in the team, focusing on those with expertise that is vital to the daily city's operation. Number 2, identify who is in charge. It is important to identify who is in charge during a disaster risk and ensure that all employees know who that person or position is. Establish a procedure for succession of management if that position or leader is not available at the time of the climate impact. That is crucial. Number 3, you need to examine the city's operation and activities. So identify internal and external operations that are important for the recovery and continuation of the city's different departments. 4, identify an alternate location, any type of event that actually will stop you to operate or will put a hazard on your people. It needs an alternate location. You need to mobilize the population and the system, the operations. So important consideration is necessary to identify a different location to run the city or different jurisdictions within the city's operation. You need to develop collaboration and viable assistance with like departments, similar departments, right? Or the Public Building Commission, the department to share facilities can get involved if necessary. Number 5, plan for citizens with special needs. So the residents, vulnerable residents with special needs, you need to be prepared for that. Always include in your plan a set of specifications to treat and meet the needs of residents with special needs or disabilities. And that also includes senior citizens, the elderly, and children. Evacuation plan. Katrina Sandy taught us a very good lesson about that. Develop an evacuation plan for every work outlet for your city's operation. It is important to identify how notice will be given in any type of event. It could be an alarm, intercom, phone call. Cell phones, of course, is a good way, but if the network is not working, which most likely it won't be operating, a siren, and so on. All city employees and staff must be aware of where to assemble in the event of an evacuation or emergency response. Shelter in place. You definitely need to plan for that. So develop a shelter-in-place plan for every address of your city's operation, every location. It is used in dealing with the climate impact outside of your location, such as flooding, tornadoes, storms, etc. So where you take cover within the structure, that will be a safe haven, a safe place for people to stay, and also you can relocate your operations to that particular location. Number 8, communications plan. You need to identify how the city's employees and staff will be advised of the emergency plan and what communications devices will be used during the event and after. So list the communication tools in order of preference, emphasizing the most effective way for communication to the least effective according to the type of impact. Number 9, emergency contact list. This is crucial. The emergency contact list identifies how to contact staff in the event of a severe weather event or an indirect climate impact, such as flooding or power outage, for example. So this will be include this will include the technical means before any type of strategy is in place in order to respond and lead actions towards restoring and aiding the city's operation and the well-being of residents. And finally, write a plan. Document and update your city's continuity management system at least once a year. FEMA do that, so they have many effective strategic outcomes throughout their history, but nowadays they became quite efficient, particularly after dealing with past events. So it is difficult to predict or analyze the type of activities, obviously. So in cities, how this impact will affect the health of the population is very important to highlight. Therefore, a continuity management system plan draws attention to the impact of disruptions that will be health risk, for example, and will identify those activities where the city's operation needs to focus for its survival. We all wish that throughout the pandemic we had, not only here in the US, but on a global scale, a continuity management system in place that will effectively deal with the after consequences of the health impact, the health event. So a continuity management system plan assists the city's leaders in recognizing what needs to be done to protect its residents and also the infrastructure of the city. It may also be able to take advantage of opportunities that might otherwise be overlooked or considered to be too high risk. So that's also an important consideration. Now, there are certain, I can call them steps, step-by-step processes that needs to be part of this particular continuity management system plan. And it's all related to actions to address climate change health events. Monitor health status. You need to diagnose and investigate health problems. You need to inform, educate, and empower people. After these drastic events, mobilize communities. Develop policies and plans that fit the level of degree of the event, the health event. Enforce laws after the event and regulations to make sure that you will be better prepared to cope with it. Ensure a competent public and personal health care system is in place, ready to act. And definitely you need to evaluate its effectiveness. And lastly, research new insights. Learn from others, from other strategies being in place in different cities. Now we're going to move to the next section. We have emphasized the importance of being proactive instead of reactive. So, continuity management plans apply the Plan, Do, Check, Act PDCA cycle. This involves planning, establishing, implementing, operating, monitoring, reviewing, maintaining, and continually improving the effectiveness of operations. So assessing the risk that affects your city and its operations is critical to organize and prepare the different departments within the jurisdictions against the potential impact of climate change. And that is could be, floodings, fires, power outage, infrastructure collapse, etc. So ultimately, the interruption of the city's ability to provide basic and immediate services such as medical care, transportation facilities, safe drinking water is essential. So I want to put emphasis on the following considerations for assessing a business continuity management plan for your city that tackles severe weather events impacting your population and their health. Historical. What type of drastic weather events have occurred in the city and its jurisdictions? Geographic. What could happen in your city considering its geographical location and vulnerabilities to climate change impacts on health? Structural. What could affect the functional ability of the city's operation? And lastly, human factors. Human cost emergencies that can result from inadequate training, supervision, or negligence. You have to ask yourself this question. What would happen if your city was involved in a severe event? Would the city survive the crisis? How would you ensure that your city endures the disaster? So that's when you apply a continuity management system that amalgamates all these factors, risk, on a consistent strategic planning. And these particular continuity management systems can be applied to the health sector, to the operations of the city, power grids, water systems, etc. So it's very versatile in nature, diverse and flexible. So it's about preparing an organization to deal with disruptive incidents that might otherwise prevent it from achieving its objectives, right? So this particular standard, which is called 22301, it is updated frequently, specifies requirements to plan, establish, implement, operate, monitor, review, maintain, and continually improve a documented management system to protect against and reduce the likelihood of the risk, prepare for the risk, and respond to them, and recover from disruptive incidents when they arise. So this particular international standard can significantly reduce risk, particularly when a lack of awareness and a concrete strategy in a continuity management plan after a disaster or impact is present. As I mentioned, it provides flexibility of implementation. You can identify what is most relevant to minimize financial loss, for example, death, infrastructure impacts, communications, and the overall operations of the city. So the effects of climate change on cities will be handled by the corresponding emergency services. That would be disaster management. But this particular international standard will allow us to be prepared before the event happens. And it can involve the healthcare. It can involve issues like a mental health crisis after the event. It can involve how we can better be prepared for the infrastructure system to be resilient to weather events. You must establish an emergency plan. You must identify who's in charge. You must examine the city's operations and activities. Plan for citizens with special needs as well. You must have an evacuation plan and a communication plan as well as a shelter in place. So adapting and using the framework is crucial for an effective response and recovery. It involves taking prior actions before the event strikes. So a proactive approach must be established along with planning for the livelihood of the severe event and its effects on public health. That will require an effort throughout all systems and subsystems, and will allow us to have the capacity to interrupt the city's operation and reassess the operation for a better functioning. So when an event impacts, there are certain operations that need to be stopped. During a heat wave, the power grid, the transmission of electricity needs to be minimized or even stopped completely because it puts a lot of stress on the system. So you have to be able to manage the different levels of risk. So I want to emphasize also the personal commitment of the city leaders to dismiss the thought that it won't happen in my city. Catastrophes happen on a daily basis. And as previously mentioned, preparedness means being proactive and planning. So that is the essence of efficient continuity planning. Now, cities have overall functions, right, that are important for maintaining a normal level of operations, but only a percentage of those operations are going to be vital for its continued normal level of functionality. So city leaders need to gather information to determine basis of their strategic planning, where they're going with it, along with a notion of basic recovery requirements in the event of a disaster. So identifying which areas and departments of operations of the city will be most affected by climate change impacts in other risks is crucial in order to develop a plan and to determine what effect it will have on the city and its systems and subsystems. So you have to develop a climate change impact analysis that will be used to establish the city's critical business activities, the resources required to support such activities, and the impact of ceasing to perform these activities. We are talking about strategy. So how can we shape, design the strategic planning program for cities? The benefit of a strategy is the reduction of potential losses compared to the base case. So the impact of a crisis depends upon its extent and duration of the event. The net benefit of a strategy is obtained by subtracting the total annual cost or impact affecting the population, the infrastructure, etc., of the alternative from its benefits. Sensitivity analysis should be used to determine how changes in the estimates of cost, losses, and probabilities would affect the selection of the strategy. You need to quantify the benefits of your strategy, and that requires reviewing all the events for which the alternative provides. It provides some protection and estimation how it can reduce the expected loss of each of those events. Keep in mind that you cannot quantify every single event that your city is facing, but you prioritize. Estimation of losses should be done in the context of the expected response for the risk that you're facing. So management, city leaders, select strategies by reviewing and rating various combinations of the strategy. So when we talk about strategy, and sometimes I go and say this strategy, it's not per se one strategy. You can have several different strategies facing different risks because you will have different solutions to come out with the answer for what you're facing, right? So it's like reverse engineering, right? You start with the outcome. You start with what is the issue that I have in front of me, and then you work around it. You go back, you work around it, how and what kind of steps you need to take to deal with that issue that you're talking about. And also, you can actually switch it, and instead of saying, this is my issue, heat waves, in my city, it's detrimentally impacting the health of the population. It's stressing the healthcare system and our resources. But you can actually start from the solution itself. You shape the solution of your strategy, and you go back and shape the steps to come out and reach that solution. So quantifying the benefits of a strategy requires reviewing all the events for which the alternative provides and give us some protection, and estimating how it reduces the expected losses. Now, before selecting the strategies, now I'm speaking in plural, it is necessary to review the resources required to conduct operations and to assess the level of resources that are available. Selecting strategies involves reviewing business continuity objectives, assessing strategies, consolidating those strategies across the organization, across the city, across the different departments of your city, determining advantages and disadvantages, it could be that too, and conducting a cost-benefit analysis as well. After senior manager has authorized the strategies and the arrangements involved, you implement it, which involves acquiring equipment, contractual agreements, you go through your supply chain, workplace changes, preparing backup and off-site facilities, and ensuring that appropriate documentation is in place. So we are revisiting the step-by-step process of a business continuity management system right there. So you need to understand the city's operation and its context, establishing risk management policy. You must create accountability associated with the management of risks. You have to integrate these risk management programs and strategies into organizational processes, providing adequate resources for the strategy and the risk management program that you have. You must establish internal and external communication, reporting mechanisms, That's something integral for the strategy and the risk management part. Now, while the city goes through the impacts of these events, we need to understand the long-term effects of the impact. Many government officials took insufficient actions or made poor decisions in the days immediately before and after events. And we can name hurricanes on the East Coast here in the U.S., droughts, in the African continent. We can again name the pandemic. So, in general, the systems that are in place today, and the officials in general, officials rely to, they failed. So city leaders, government officials at all levels failed to provide effective leadership. These individual failures also occur against a backdrop of failure over time to develop the capacity for a coordinated local, national response to a truly catastrophic event. Whether caused by nature or man-made, it doesn't matter. So, in regards of, we're going to talk about this in the following slides, but the public and private sector interdependencies are crucial. So these interdependencies between the public and the private sector are very essential, and they need to be identified. For example, a city's emergency management plan depends on and should incorporate the plans of local telecommunications and healthcare providers. So the business continuity plan for a financial service provider would, for a flood event, depend on the plans for the city subway and the bus systems. So we can see they're all correlated. I just mentioned transportation, healthcare, all together, just to be part of the solutions to those risks. Often, however, the dependencies are not as readily apparent. Even when we say they should be considered, they are now in practice there. Let's provide examples. So during Hurricane Katrina, buses were available, but bus drivers were not. Sounds ironic, but it happened. When asked why the National Guard, and it's not a laughing matter, of course, I just put a smile in my face while I'm reading this and analyzing, and this is being published in one of my books for the record. It's just not only ironic, but it's just urgent to take care of these particular issues, because those things disrupt the whole strategy altogether. So the National Guard could not have supply bus drivers. So definitely was a miscommunication among different departments, and again, working in silos. Because all interdependencies cannot be foreseen, emergency management and business continuity planners need to incorporate planning tools in their planning process that provide a process used to identify interdependencies. After doing this, planners can then meet their counterparts in the private and public sectors to ensure that their plans are congruent and that no holes exist. Because we witness in so many different climatic events, like Katrina and other type of events, many gaps between the step that we need to follow to have a complete and comprehensive strategy in place. And be pragmatic about it. Make it happen when it's needed. So for that, to facilitate the process of identifying these interdependencies, we provide a preliminary methodology. So, for example, from the perspective of the public sector, but a similar example could be presented from the private sector perspective. The public sector case joins the 4 emergency management planning factors, another element that has been mentioned in our risk management programs. So in that regard, given these factors for both the public and private sectors, a methodology can be used to examine possible private-public interdependencies that occur in different phases of the planning process. Now, building resilience and using international standards and frameworks to accomplish what is needed to be done to have a comprehensive and pragmatic approach to the risk. So organizational resilience management is a management framework comprised of planning, decision-making, and execution needed to anticipate, prevent, if conditions allow it, prepare and respond to disruptive events such as climate change, public health risks, and changes in the environment that detrimentally affect the city. So there are many international standards, and they can help us to shape and guide us to have a strategy in place that can be modified, that can be edited, it can be adapted to circumstances, but it will always be there and be part of the policy making process. So in this case, we can talk about a British standard 65,000, which is organizational resilience. But you can use different standards or adapt one standard and another, blend them together and see where the positive outcome of it. So in essence, what we need is to provide guidance on building organizational resilience by identifying the core requirements that a city must meet to be considered resilient. The standard also helps city leaders to develop and implement, as well as identify and recommend practices that are already established in other standards and disciplines. So, as I just said, they are correlated, they can work together and complement each other. So what this means in practice is that this particular standard defines value as a function of risk. Now, city leaders' decision-making process and initiatives can preserve or increase value, but they can also gradually erode value. Because despite the wishful thinking of many city leaders, risk is unavoidable, period. It is a central part of the quest of value. As adapting to climate change becomes fundamentally important to the resilience of the city and the populations, strategic planning leaders need to think of risk as not something to avoid. Instead, they should view as something that is there to manage across all sectors of their city's departments and divisions. That provide public safety, healthcare services, communications, transportation, and security. In the case of the ISO 65000 and the ones related to it and the new updated ones, it provides a management system that forms the basis for establishing and building resilience. So it highlights the need for systems and processes that will help spur good decision making. The framework enables a city to prepare, initiate, and manage a climate change adaptation program. So if the city leaders they already have an adaptation program, they can use this particular framework to shape it and even improve it. Because it can provide guidance on enhancing the organizational resilience of the city and articulating the crucial benefits for adaptation plans. Existing standards within the crisis and business continuity management systems, which have an impact on the overall governance of the city, enhance their practices by integrating the disciplines and coordinating the necessary steps and initiatives for city resilience. Now, implementing, this 65,000 international standard will promote resilience for cities because it will enable them to adapt efficiently to unexpected and disruptive events. In regards of the investment part of it, there's going to be an investment to put these systems in effect. So the British Standard 65,000 can help reduce cost and maximize operational efficiency by minimizing hazards that exacerbate vulnerabilities. Implementing these solutions is crucial to the survival of the city because resilient organizations prosper regardless of the adverse climatic conditions and its health impacts. So, building resilience, building capacity. So managing and minimizing risk provides capital investment opportunities, right, for the cities. And it does because of initiatives undertaken by local governments. And with the involvement of the private sector, as we stated before, as we mentioned before, capital investment must focus on upgrading the city's infrastructure through deep energy retrofits by involving owners and investors in carrying them out across the city's infrastructure, supported by a strategic-minded finance community. With a focus on the fundamental facilities and systems serving the city, including the services and facilities necessary for its economic function. Therefore, adaptation plans cannot be the sole strategy for megacities and cities in general. So the thing is, about adaptation plans, we hear that a lot. Like is the great solution that we were looking for. So an adaptation per se is not going to be the sole solution for all these issues. The issues are too complex and definitely interconnected with each other. And they cause a boomerang effect. So adaptation plans cannot be the sole strategy for cities to cope with climate change impacts and health risks. Efficient functioning of the city depends on the ability to reach a desired level of resilience. Adaptation and disaster risk reduction, which is very popular, and the United Nations use it quite often, and they have actually great departments. I worked in some research papers with some of their leaders. They complement each other. It's an all-inclusive strategy. So, from an environmental science approach, where climate change adaptation is emerging, Adaptation strategies translate onto shifting environmental conditions. So disaster risk management programs and reduction strategies can actually extend to social, physical, and economic factors and complement adaptation strategies. So disaster risk reduction strategies are able to identify the wider constraints that determine vulnerability, while adaptation strategies focus on developing hazards, forecasting, and early warning systems. In theory, disaster risk reduction extends beyond disaster preparedness in its measures. So definitely there's a positive side of it. And these interconnections and how they complement each other is key to find the right strategy for the events that the city is facing. We said before that we need to identify clear objectives. And that applies to capacity building and building a resilient strategy for a resilient city. So this approach is built upon regulations and compliance that direct away from and lessen the risk that increase vulnerabilities. So the prevention and alleviation of those threats become part of an agenda. And they emphasize measures of outcomes and community sustainability. So as the number of urban settlers increase rapidly around the world, the social aspect of this plan becomes fundamental to a progressive development because infrastructure is a matter of interest and importance for community resilience. Risk reduction strategies must lead to actionable concepts and practices towards minimizing threats, as well as evaluating and managing the issues that lead to disasters. So the reduction of health risk is a fundamental concept for any strategic planning. So that includes reducing exposure to hazards, to health outcomes, addressing the city's vulnerability and how effective is the healthcare system in take actionable steps to minimize health risks. And definitely to have a proactive approach towards severe weather events and climate variability as a whole. Several factors help leaders of cities to build resilience. Action through policies and strategic planning should integrate the risks associated with climate events and public health. And the city's infrastructure has to be included as well. And as we mentioned, the healthcare system. Conventional planning processes, project designs and projects that involve development of healthcare systems into the decision-making process needs to become the dynamic foundation for disaster risk reduction in any type of risk management and continuity system. As I mentioned a few seconds ago, city leaders must consider building capacity for local institutions to move forward. And they need to move forward large and complex plans and to match local demand for resilience with financial support. And there we go, private and public partnerships. Organizational resilience forces leaders into building the capacity to adapt. And that what this particular standard, British standard, does. It involves strategic problem solving to create sustainable change for the city, and in correlation to the environment. Building resilience also means adapting quickly to circumstances and conditions outside the standard model. So rapid urbanization causing environmental degradation amplifies vulnerability and exposure to cities, right? So therefore, exposure needs to be minimized, vulnerability reduced, and resilience capacity built up to reduce disaster and climate change health risk. Therefore, a healthcare system which is resilient with the risk reduction plan needs to complement each other and entail a continual effort across the economic, social, cultural, environmental, institutional, and political spheres to move from vulnerability to resilience. Now, for continuity plans and resilience, the organizational structure and the extent of community participation are significant considerations for cities' plans to become resilient. So the efforts here can assist local governments in working along with their communities, addressing vulnerabilities, and solidifying their relationships. As I said previously, get in touch with the community, understand their needs, their wants, their vulnerabilities and susceptibilities to the impacts. Make an assessment of the access to care, to health care. So the city's organizational survival and resilience and its readiness to implement a pre-disaster and continuity strategic plan on climate change health risks and consequently mitigate the risks associated with climate change and health is building a resilient structure with proper and efficient services that accommodate the vulnerable population and efficiently deliver the actually supplies, services, in what the community needs to survive. And this is all related to governance, because governance is concerned with improving the performance of the city in this case for the benefit of the stakeholders, the economic growth, in the public as a whole. So it focuses on the relationships between the board of directors, managers, and shareholders. So city leaders can benefit from a comprehensive framework that addresses good governance principles and the principle of good governance, and to support and improve the already established program the city has implemented. So improving the performance of a city's operation must be a priority. I just talked about the supplies, the services that need to be provided to the public. So the city leaders need to focus on these relationships between all these elements and work not in silos but together in a cooperative way to be definitely more efficient to mitigate risks and to develop and implement the proper strategic plan according to the risk facing. So effective governance must be assured through strong commitment by the people at all levels within the entity, right? A policy that supports the challenges and demands of governing must be in place with a clear policy statement that encompasses the entity commitments, the city's commitment to good governance. So cities, in this case, will be able to cover all the necessary components of good governance, at the corporate level and at the private level as well, in the public sector. So those synergies for cooperation can be developed. In essence, the governing body must understand, promote, and be responsible for good governance. So, moving forward, we definitely need to understand, for city leaders, to understand that accountability and responsibility play a key role in governance, and the willingness of the owners of the entity to behave like owners and put the right of ownership into effect. That is a resilient society. So these actions cause leaders to express their views to board of directors or other city leaders, when accountability and responsibility have a sense of urgency. They can also organize and exercise their shareholder franchise. If they do not receive a, let's say, a satisfactory response, they can act accordingly. So the rights and obligations of the shareholders and the city leaders can be followed by all entities and all members of the city structure and operations, with an emphasis on effective governance and for the development and implementation of a risk management plan that can be tailored to their current strategy. Now we're going to go to the next section. There are several methods of classifying risks, but most approaches use some risk measurements involving event probabilities and impacts. So this score can be used to prioritize risk. A city develops a strategy to manage risk through avoidance, right? Eliminate risky activities, eliminate the risk completely. But it can also transfer risk. It can reassign risk. It can reduce the risk, reducing the likelihood and the impact of it. And also acceptance. You can accept the risk. You can retain the risk. Some risks are tolerable, and some others have co-benefits for society. So strategies may prevent disasters, provide backup for lost resources, or specify alternative resources. So a strategy may provide protection against only one event or against many events. Continuity strategies increase the city's capability to respond to events in order to continue operations. And also recovery strategies to improve the city's capability to return to stable operations following an event. So now talking about strategies, risk strategies include alternate sites, backup equipment, building fortify your structures, distributed processing, distributed warehousing, insurance, manual overrides, maximizing work hours, multiply the supply chain, the suppliers, mutual aid agreements, outsourcing, personal protective equipment, portable equipment, quick resupply, reciprocal agreements, redundant operations, remote site storage, social distancing, and social distancing policies. Subcontractors can also play a role in it. Temporary structures, work for client locations or different locations that allow you to continue operations. So some crises have associated warning periods, right? So in which case it may be possible to preposition the team, the city employees, and the equipment to a safer location. A crisis can affect a large area, and in addition to direct organization damages, the normal community infrastructure and the support systems as well. And all these elements may be degraded. So relocation of the city systems and structures within the community may be difficult or impossible in some cases, particularly in the short term. Occasional, they add the expenditure required for contingency planning, which is insignificant because it can be combined with other plans. For example, the decision to decentralize operations is made simultaneously as additional spaces being acquired for growth. So you can actually find synergy right there. Certain actions complement each other and be part of your strategy. Available strategies need to be evaluated for each critical function. So some strategies over multiple events and cover several operations are viable. So off-site strategies, for example, provide coverage for the broadest range of events, whereas on-site backups, that could be a cost-effective action and convenient solution for some events. The selection of a set of preferred strategies depends on cost and benefits, so you have to prioritize when you strategize. A strategy involves both one-time costs and recurring costs. So the costs are annualized to allow for comparison of strategies. So one-time costs include the cost of facilities, equipment, computer hardware, other items like furniture, staff, and consulting. All this has to be part of your strategic planning. So recurring costs include the cost of renting, leasing, maintenance, services, personnel, supplies, and utilities. So the cost of a strategy increases as allowable downtime decreases. For example, a short-term frame may require a standby building and backup equipment for you to be ready for any type of chaotic event, a drastic event. So the total annual cost is the sum of the annualized one-time cost and the recurring annual costs. So quantifying the benefits of a strategy requires reviewing all the events for which the alternative provides some protection and estimating how it reduces the expected loss of each of these events. Therefore, estimation of losses should be done in the context of the expected response of competitors. So you can compare yourself with other city and city budgets. So the strength of that particular relationship and the impact of your operations should be considered in conjunction with insurance coverage for the private sector and the city. So the benefit of a strategy is the reduction of potential losses, right? Compared to the base case. So the impact of a crisis depends upon its extent and duration of it. So the net benefit of a strategy is obtained by subtracting the total annual cost of the alternative from its benefits. Sensitivity analysis, which is used in the private sector, and the city should use this particular analysis as well, should be used to determine how changes in the estimates of costs, losses, and probabilities would affect the selection of the strategy, so it can be much more efficient while planning for it. So management selects strategies by reviewing and rating various combinations of strategies. So the advantages and disadvantages of the strategies should be determined, and the suitability of the strategies should be assessed against the impact analysis. Some of the evaluation criteria include cost, service level, time to switch, reliability, and how manageable they are. So management judgment is used to both assigning the ratings and selecting the strategies. So before selecting the strategies, it's necessary to review the resources required to conduct operations and to assess the level of resources that are available for your strategy. Selecting those strategies involves reviewing the continuity objectives, assessing strategies, consolidating strategies across the city, determining advantages and disadvantages of it, and conducting a cost-benefit analysis. So after senior management within the city structure has authorized the strategies, arrangements must be made to implement them, which involves acquiring equipment, contractual agreements, workplace changes, preparing backup and off-site facilities, and ensuring that appropriate documentation is in place. So now, all these elements will help us not only to strategize accordingly, but also to prevent, minimize public health hazards, provide backup for lost resources, and even specify alternative resources. So the city operations, the systems, and the healthcare system is better prepared to cope with health risks. Let's move to the next slide. Now we reach the conclusion of our presentation, and I want to emphasize the following. Climate, public health, and cities resilience is about system changes that promote better health, livable space, and sustainable communities. Whether climate policy, equitable healthcare delivery, or early identification of emerging pathogens. Now we understand that individual actions cannot resolve collective problems. Therefore, a cooperative approach to respond to climate change is needed. Actions towards adaptation to and mitigation of climate change impacts on health are generally warranted by the risk this issue presents to cities. So climate change is on the forefront of public attention. So the risks affecting entire populations are clearer now than ever. Although climate change has received a fair amount of consideration, particularly after several droughts, flooding, and hurricanes here in the United States, and events around the world in recent years, a comprehensive strategy to address climate change and public health is not in place. It should be of utmost priority to implement it, as health professionals have the responsibility to prevent health risk and provide proper treatment. So climate change provides opportunities to city leaders to develop and implement policies and pragmatic initiatives that particularly target the poor, and as a consequence, benefit the whole population, as their vulnerabilities are exacerbated by climate change. So climate change impacts can create a global chain reaction of effects that will be devastating for the world community. So the identification of risk and the repercussions on public health is an important step for developing suitable actions. So policies made to address climate change can be adopted more speedily and efficiently as the evidence of the effects on health become more tangible. So the awareness of the health risk to humanity will lead to a comprehensive strategy plan for cities, and we build a case for policies and procedures as well, so that directly aim at the problem. So the increasing unpredictability of severe weather events and the consequences of climate change, like higher temperatures and changing landscape, make systematic strategies more challenging in efficiently addressing risk. So rapid change requires flexibility and creativity, which are seldom characteristics associated with formalized planning. So most cities view strategic planning as a static framework that is neither adaptive nor directive, and we presented a good case today about that. So implementation of risk management frameworks with a strategic adaptive cognition and the other strategies that we presented today builds resilient systems, resilient communities, and institutions that are strong, are adaptable, and have the capacity for rapid recovery. I mentioned Michael Porter, Harvard professor, a few times today, and he said the following: it is strategically important to make change. Any project or any program is just inevitable, embedded in a strategy for the overall organization, and ultimately, if we don't understand that strategy, we can't decide whether we have the right project or program. If we don't have clarity on the strategy, we can't decide whether we got the right goals and expectations. So if we don't have a clear sense of the overall strategy, it is very hard to connect a project or program to what's going on elsewhere within the city's organization structure and systems in a way that ultimately delivers value. So in general terms, strategies to develop resilient societies and risk management frameworks are reciprocal and mutually connected. So the risk management doctrine applies to a diverse set of entities that addresses risk and different types of risk and environment, but also share a common goal of coping hazards in an efficient way. So risk management strategies contribute to the achievement of resilience by identifying opportunities to build resilience into planning and resourcing in order to attain the goal of minimizing risk while enabling the mitigation of consequences of any disasters that do occur. So now we know that we are confronting a challenge that has not been faced by society before. So, and the world community cannot avoid the threats. So as a consequence of inaction, we are going to be paralyzed by the event, and it will be costly. So we have an obligation to present a concrete strategy to the current generation, the present generation, and future generations to act accordingly to prevent the far-reaching effects of climate change, as we have the resources, determination, and leadership to address the severity of the issues. So the success of deterring climate change and its impacts on health of the urban population will depend on how rapidly and efficiently global adaptation and mitigation strategies are implemented. So city leaders need to find a common ground of understanding the critical issue, as our survival depends on it, upon the immediate actions of all parties involved. So now, I think this is crucial. So the fundamental approach to the adverse risk posed by climate change to the world's welfare is management, which require a comprehensive and all-inclusive sustainable management and strategic planning approach. So the analysis, projection, processes for improvement, and objectives for leadership change that are presented in this particular lecture today will enable world leaders, city leaders as well, scientists, policymakers, healthcare workers, the academic community, and planners to take a bold and innovative approach to the problems of climate change. So these actions should prioritize protecting the ecosystem and natural resources and promoting social and economic opportunities. So this internal relationship provides the tools to critical planning, closely related to sustainable development, and of course a sustainable economic system, and environmental and social equity and progress. So the strategic planning presented today provides a forward-thinking approach, confronts and tackles those issues, and sits at the core of setting up a concrete method and direction to achieve specific goals. Therefore, this particular presentation offers a series of highly important strategies and innovative approaches to the common concern, as well as a very well thought description of climate change health risks and subsequently consequences of their impacts on people. Now, in regards of the strategic approach to urban systems and urban populations, we need to understand that this strategic, operational, and also the scientific process to gather data, information to address and act towards this climatic risk needs to be part of the whole strategic approach without any political meddling. A radical paradigm shift in the way of thinking and acting is necessary to sway the course of climate change impacts on the urban population's health. Now is the time to implement a proactive rather than reactive management of climate change risk, and for the city leaders to claim the validity and significance of sustainability and to advocate for the well-being of the global community. And don't leave yet. I have a little more to share. Thank you.
All right, so just to finalize a little bit about me, I'm a professor of sustainable urbanization and development at Nalanda University. I also conducted symposiums and lectures at Harvard Global Health Institute, Harvard Innovation Symposium, University of Miami, and other entities, global entities like the United Nations and the World Bank, and being a member of the Climate and ICT Solutions under the United Nations Momentum for Change. In addition, I am the lead author currently for the Climate Resilience and Investment Program for the Sub-Saharan Africa for the World Bank, and I'm being in the private sector for the last 20 years, working currently with T-Mobile and Deutsche Telekom in the technology and sustainability sector. As you can see, there's links of my published books, Climate Health Risk and Megacities, and Innovation and Communication Technology for Sustainable Development. You're more than welcome to check it out, and please send me an email. I'll be more than happy to find synergies and collaborating opportunities regarding these pressing and challenging issues. Once again, thank you so much for your attention, and until next.